The room had been sealed, then forgotten. The yellow tape at the door sagged in a tired curve. Its printed warning faded to the color of old straw. Dust lay on the floorboards in a thin, undisturbed film, softening every footprint from the night when people still thought this would be solved. Now the air inside the small New York walk-up felt closed and still, as if it had learned to hold its breath and never let it go. Detective Samuel paused in the doorway, gloved hand resting lightly against the frame. The apartment had not changed since the scene was first logged in 1986. The same narrow sofa pressed against the wall, the same leaning floor lamp with its crooked shade, the same kitchen table with one chair pushed back, just a few inches out of line, as if someone had stood up in a hurry and never sat down again. A camera flash had once lit this place in harsh bursts. Now there was only the weak gray of late afternoon threading through the blinds, cross-cutting the room with pale stripes. Stepped in, the boards giving a quiet, tired sound beneath his weight. Somewhere below, the building groaned with the slow adjustments of old pipes. The file named her, Marina, aged 27 at the time of death. She had come to New York from Odesa at 19, working days at a small East Village bookstore, nights taking community college classes in design. No record, no disputes on paper, rent paid on time. Friends described her as steady, practical, soft-spoken, the sort of person who was noticed only when she was no longer there. He remembered the first time he'd seen this room, as a rookie on his second year, holding a notebook too clean and a pen that shook just enough to annoy him. The senior detectives had moved through the scene with practiced calm. He had been the one standing near the door, trying to understand the shape of the absence in the air. Now, decades later, he looked at the same space and felt the same outline of that absence, sharper with age. The case had never closed. The file had drifted to the back of the cabinet, spine faded, edges worn. Evidence boxes were stacked somewhere in the deep rows of the cold case warehouse, labeled in handwriting that belonged to people long retired. On the small kitchen counter, a row of items remained as they had been logged. A chipped mug, a plate with the faint outline of something once placed there, an ashtray with a single, long-ago cigarette butt labeled end. And beside them, preserved in plastic, a Polaroid photograph face down, the white border yellowing. Picked it up. The plastic sleeve crackled softly. The evidence tag, written in blue ink, gave only a number and the date, November 24, 1986. Scene photo, recovered from victim's desk. He turned it over. The image was dark, colors flattened by age. It showed the same room but alive. Marina standing near the window, shoulders slightly turned, eyes not quite looking at the camera. The lamp behind her was on, casting a gentle halo along her hair. On the table, a sketchbook lay open, a pencil across its pages. Someone had taken the picture from the doorway. Seen then, it was just a snapshot in a quiet life. Seen now, it was something else, a fixed moment from before a line had been crossed. He held the photo at arm's length, studying the edges, the door chain resting open, the clock on the wall frozen in time by the shutter, the corner of a second shadow barely there, overlapping Marina's sleeve. He had stood in this doorway before and missed it. They all had. The unsolved case hung in the silence between him and the image. Marina's file, thick with interviews and reports that led nowhere, waited on his desk back at the precinct. New directives from the department had placed old homicides under renewed review. Her case had been just one among many, until one small note in the inventory list drew someone's eye. A photograph, misfiled, logged, then never properly catalogued. He slipped the Polaroid back into its sleeve, the plastic sighing shut. The room smelled of dry wood and stale paint, like a stage set left up after the audience had gone. For years, the city had walked past this building, unaware that a question still lived on the third floor. Stood in the center of the room, listening to the quiet. The city outside murmured through the walls. The old mistake was simple. They had believed they had seen everything worth seeing. Now, looking at the fading image in his hand, he understood that the real work was only beginning. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The folder arrived on his desk with no ceremony. Just a soft thud beside his coffee cup and the quiet scrape of cardboard against wood. Cold Case Review Batch C, the clerk said, already turning away. There's a note from archives clipped on top. The precinct around moved at its usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards tapping, a copier humming somewhere down the hall. He finished the last sip of coffee, then opened the folder. Inside, the top sheet was standard. Case number, victim's name, date of incident. His eyes moved to the handwriting in the margin, written in neat, cramped letters. Addendum, newly recovered item from misfiled evidence box, potentially relevant. See attached photo. He turned the page and found the Polaroid. Not the one he had seen in the apartment, but a high-resolution scan of it, digitally enhanced. Beneath the image, a brief report from the archive technician. They had been digitizing old evidence photographs for storage. One of the scanners had flagged a file with inconsistent catalog information. The evidence tag referenced Marina's case, but the item had been logged in a different box entirely, another unconnected investigation from the late 80s. The error had kept it from any systematic review. The technician had done what the form instructed, corrected the digital label, then opened the file to verify its contents. His note was careful, understated, but clear. Possible unidentified second person in reflection. Recommend review by investigating unit. Pulled the scan closer. The photograph was the same as the one he'd held at the apartment. Marina near the window, lamp behind her, sketchbook on the table. But now the details were sharper. The contrast had been adjusted, shadows pulled forward, grain reduced. He focused on the right edge of the frame. There, in the faint reflection of the window glass, a face appeared. Partial, fragmented. Not enough for an easy identification, but enough to know one thing with certainty. Marina had not been alone when the photo was taken. He zoomed in on the printout with a magnifier from his drawer, tracing the outline of a jaw, the suggestion of a collar. The angle of the reflection suggested someone standing just behind the photographer, or perhaps slightly to the side. The eyes were indistinct, but the posture seemed relaxed, familiar. The original scene report from 1986 listed the photograph as personal photo, victim alone. Whoever had logged it had not caught the reflection, or if they had dismissed it as distortion. He read the archive technician's statement again. No speculation, just a sequence of actions: misfile, discovery, review. The case had not reopened because of sudden inspiration or chance confession. It had reopened because someone had followed procedure in a quiet room full of boxes, letting the system do what it was designed to do when given time and attention. That was what made it hold. He opened Marina's original file. The paper smelled faintly of dust and the old toner used on typewritten forms. He found the evidence inventory and ran a finger down the list until he reached the entry for the Polaroid. The description stopped at single subject. No notation about anyone else. He leaned back, letting the information settle. Unsolved homicides did not return to life easily. The department had criteria: potential for new forensic testing, existence of viable witnesses, possibility of current threat. Most stayed dormant. This one had surfaced because a technician noticed an irregular catalog number and did what the manual said. It wasn't sudden drama. It was the slow, quiet weight of accumulated detail. Logged into the system and entered a request to re-examine all physical evidence from Marina's case. There would be delays, forms to approve, shelves to search, but the new image changed the classification. The file no longer represented a sealed mystery. It contained an unexamined detail. He printed the enhanced photograph and slid it into a clear sleeve of his own. On the back, in his handwriting, he wrote, "Reflection, unknown, potential witness or subject." Later in the briefing room, his captain listened with arms crossed as placed the photo on the table between them. "You're sure?" the captain asked. "I'm sure it's someone," said. "We treated this as if she was alone. She was." The captain studied the image for a long moment. Could be a neighbor walking past the door. Could be nothing. "It could be," agreed. "But the angle is wrong for that. They're inside, close enough to the lamp to catch the light." There was a brief silence. The distant sound of a siren rose and fell outside the windows. "Fine," the captain said at last. "You can reopen the review. No media, no announcements. Internal only. Start with the file. If it still has legs after that, we move." As left the room, the photograph felt heavier in his hand than its weight allowed. The case had not been given a grand new beginning. It had been nudged, quietly, back into motion by a single overlooked image and the patient work of someone filing in the background. In the cold case archive, a light above one row of shelves flickered on. Somewhere in that quiet space, Marina's box waited to be pulled down again. This time, the room would not be filled with rookies trying to prove themselves. It would be one investigator, older, slower, carrying a new picture of an old scene. The crucial evidence was small, almost modest, a half-seen face in a reflection, but it was enough to disturb the stillness that had settled around her name. And now, stillness was no longer an option. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. The cold case room occupied a corner of the precinct that people passed without thinking. No windows, low ceiling, rows of metal shelves holding boxes in uniform shades of brown and gray. A humming air vent kept the temperature steady, flattening the air into something neutral and almost scentless, except for the faint trace of cardboard and paper aging in place. Stood at the end of aisle C7, reading labels until his eyes found the number he wanted. The box for Marina's case sat at shoulder height, its lid marked by a strip of red tape, standard for homicides from the 80s. He slid it out carefully, feeling the familiar tug in his shoulder, and carried it to the long central table. When he lifted the lid, the sound was soft but distinct. Inside, stacked in measured order, lay the history of the investigation, scene photos, typed reports, interview transcripts, lab results. Each document had been produced by someone doing a job at a specific moment. Together, they formed the record of how the case had been understood, and in the end, how it had been allowed to go quiet. He did not start with the photographs. Those had already been by better lenses than his eyes. Instead, he pulled out the original incident report, printed on thin, slightly translucent paper. The heading bore the date, November 24, 1986. He read it slowly. Patrol officers responding to a welfare check initiated by the victim's employer. Bookstore staff had reported repeated failure to reach her and her absence from 2 consecutive shifts. Officers arriving at the building had found the front door locked, no signs of forced entry. The super had opened the unit with a master key. Inside, they found Marina lying near the bedroom doorway. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life. He scanned the descriptions of the scene, positions, distances, temperatures, written in the cool language of procedure. No forced entry. No obvious struggle recorded beyond a few displaced items. Windows closed, door locked from the inside. That last detail had once steered the case toward a narrow set of theories. A known visitor, someone with a key, a chain not engaged. He moved to the interview transcripts. The bookstore manager, who sometimes walked her halfway home, a neighbor in the apartment next door who had reported hearing the faint sound of a television that night, then nothing. The building superintendent who had mentioned that Marina kept to herself, paid on time, never caused trouble. The words lay flat on the page, but between them he could sense the lives that had moved on after giving them. He found the statement from Marina's landlord, separate from the super, a man who owned several buildings in the area. The interview was short, almost perfunctory. No complaints, no late rent, no disputes. He circled one line with a pencil. Landlord confirms victim had requested minor repairs to front door lock. Work order pending. That detail had been there all along, but it had not been flagged as significant. In 1986, it might have seemed incidental. Now, paired with the image of the door chain hanging open in the Polaroid, it added weight to the idea that she had been waiting for someone, or at least accustomed to letting people in. He kept reading. There was a note from an early canvassing of the block. A deli owner remembered seeing Marina with a tall guy, dark coat, a few weeks before the incident. No name, no further description. Another neighbor mentioned occasional visitors who looked like students. None of it had cohered into a clear suspect. Back then, it had seemed too vague to carry. He turned to the lab reports. The science of that time looked fragile compared to current standards. Fiber comparisons, basic blood typing, partial prints that could not be matched with the limited databases of the era. Several items, cigarette butt, glassware, doorknob swabs, had been logged as inconclusive. Now, with improved methods, some of those samples might still offer information. The new request he had filed would move them to the forensic queue, where machines would do what they could. But it was not only the evidence that interested him. It was the pattern in how it had been read. Near the bottom of the box, under a stack of supplemental memos, he found a handwritten note clipped to a thin file. The note was unsigned, the ink slightly faded. Follow-up interview suggested with L. Claims not to know victim outside work, but phone records show multiple after-hours calls. Time constraints prevented second interview. Time constraints, another phrase that, at the moment it was written, had likely seemed unremarkable, another piece that had never been picked up again. He opened the attached file. Inside was the first and only interview with Lisa, aged 23 at the time, part-time clerk at the bookstore. Her answers were precise, polite, and limited. She had worked with Marina 3 days a week. They had got along fine. They did not socialize outside of shifts. She knew nothing about Marina's personal life. Above the transcript, the detective who had led the interview had made a brief annotation. No apparent connection beyond professional. Yet the note about phone records told a narrower story. Calls made from the bookstore line to Marina's number after closing hours. More than once. Multiple dates. He leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment, assembling the pieces in order. A door lock waiting for repairs. A chain left hanging open. A reflected face in a window. After-hours calls from someone who had no time for a second interview. The case had not been mishandled through clear error. It had thinned out along the edges where human attention is most likely to fray. A postponed follow-up, a misfiled photo, a work order never checked. He reopened his eyes and drew 3 small boxes on a legal pad. In each, he wrote a name from the file that now seemed less background and more central. Lisa, Victor Hale, landlord, Elia's building superintendent. Different positions in Marina's life, different reasons to have access to her door. He underlined each name once and noted the relevant detail beside it. Phone calls, lock repairs, master key. Nothing yet pointed cleanly to one person. That was not what he expected at this stage. The work now was to build a new map of the old terrain, using the same landmarks but a different sense of distance. He closed the file slowly, the paper whispering against itself. Somewhere above the windowless room, the city moved in layers of sound and light. Down here, progress was measured in graphite marks and silent corrections. On the table beside the box, the enhanced photograph of Marina lay under a sheet protector, her half-smile paused forever mid-breath. In the reflected glass beside her, the blurred suggestion of another life waited to be named. The overlooked details were not dramatic. They were small, procedural, and quiet. But as looked at the list of names and the square outlines around them, he understood that the next step would not be taken in the archive. It would be taken in the present, with people who had thought the past would stay where they had left it. The city received him with its usual indifference as stepped out of the precinct and into the muted late winter afternoon. A steady wind drifted between the buildings, carrying a faint mineral chill. He walked with slow, measured purpose, Marina's reconstructed file under his arm. The next stage required conversation, quiet, careful conversation, with people who had built new lives over the decades, unaware that an old thread might be pulled again. He started with the name easiest to locate, Elia's, the former superintendent of the building where Marina had lived, was now in his late 70s, living in a small retirement apartment near the Hudson. The room smelled faintly of tea and old carpet when opened the door, leaning slightly on a wooden cane, his gesture cordial but cautious. "I remember her," said, lowering himself into a chair. His voice carried a faint rasp of age, but beneath it a certain steadiness. Quiet, always polite, never made noise, didn't cause trouble. Asked about the night of the incident, though he did not use the old word. His gaze drifted toward the window, as though searching for something on the river. "I was home," he said, "with my wife. She was still alive then. We were watching a game on the radio. Didn't leave the building until morning." Let the silence hold for a moment. Had carried the master key in those years, a small detail that placed him closer to Marina's door than most. Yet nothing in his manner hinted at concealment, only the slow erosion of time. Still, proximity remained proximity. He thanked, took a few notes, and moved on. The next name on his list required more distance. Victor Hale, the landlord. Hale now managed several properties from a modest office tucked above a laundromat in Queens. Found him reviewing papers behind a neat desk, his hair silvered, his suit slightly rumpled but clean. Hale remembered Marina as well, though distantly. Reliable tenant, he said, paid early sometimes, didn't argue about rent. When asked about the door lock repair that Marina had requested, Hale frowned at the memory. "Old buildings," he said. "We were behind on a lot of work orders back then. I sent someone, I think, or I meant to." His voice carried no defensiveness, only a mild impatience with ancient paperwork. "Look, I own properties all over the city. Repairs get done. Eventually." Noted the phrasing. Eventually did not help Marina. Then came the question about alibis. "That night," Hale repeated, "I was home with my wife and kids. You can ask them, though I doubt they remember." No evasiveness, no tension, but also no certainty. Another person close enough through obligation, though perhaps not through intention. It was the third name, Lisa, that pulled the tone of things into a sharper focus. She lived in a rent-controlled brownstone in Brooklyn, where the hallway smelled faintly of incense and old newspapers. When she opened the door, she looked older than her years, mid-50s now, but carried a reserved composure. Her eyes flicked briefly to the badge, then steadied on's face. "This is about Marina," she said quietly, even before he asked. Her apartment was simple, tidy, illuminated by soft window light. They sat at a small table near the kitchen. Lisa folded her hands, knuckles pale. She was kind, Lisa said. Soft-spoken, focused on her work. We talked sometimes during closing shifts. Not about anything heavy, just small things. She hesitated. I liked her, but we weren't close. Mentioned the after-hours calls. Her stillness sharpened almost imperceptibly. That was a long time ago, she said. We'd sometimes call about schedule changes, inventory issues, nothing more. Her voice was calm, but its cadence had changed, an extra beat between sentences. Not defensive, not exactly, but guarded in a way that suggested unspoken contours beneath her words. He watched her carefully. Did you visit her apartment? No, Lisa said, too fast, though she quickly softened the tone. No, I never did. He felt the small imbalance in the answer. Not proof, never that, but a detail worth pinning down. When he stood to leave, Lisa walked him to the door. Her expression remained composed, but something in her eyes hinted at weight she had carried for a very long time. As stepped into the hallway, he wrote one line in his notebook. Hesitation when asked about calls. It wasn't suspicion yet. It was simply a marker, a shift in tone. By the time he returned to the precinct, the list of potential suspects had taken shape. 3 people connected to Marina through work, residence, or proximity. Each with a plausible alibi. Each with a reason, however small, to enter her life without drawing notice. Each carrying gaps in recollection shaped by decades of distance. None of them stood out sharply. None of them vanished from possibility. In a case built on absence, the presence of multiple quiet motives was its own kind of signal. 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The precinct felt heavier that evening, its lights washing the hallways in pale sheets of brightness that made the shadows beneath desks seem deeper. Sat alone in the conference room, the enhanced photograph pinned to a corkboard, Marina on one side, the mirrored fragment of a face on the other. Between them, a scatter of notes, interview excerpts, and a printout of the work order log. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, and studied the pattern. It was faint, almost too faint, but not absent. The first thread tugged quietly at him, the door lock. Marina had requested repairs days before the incident. The log listed the request, but there was no confirmation that the work had been completed. Hale had offered vague recollection but no documentation. If the lock had remained faulty, someone familiar with the building's slips and delays could have used that knowledge. That pointed faintly toward the superintendent, or someone who had observed the maintenance routines. But the next thread pointed elsewhere. He lifted the transcript from the interview with Lisa, reading again her response about visiting Marina's apartment. The refusal had been immediate, too quick. People seldom remembered